When I saw Foundation, I realized it's one of those sci-fi shows that tells us a lot about our own society. There's one part in particular when a mathematician finds a way to literally predict the future of society that just stuck with me. And it's because I realized the leaders we have in our world do the exact same thing, but it's making all of our lives worse. So the story of Foundation is set over 25,000 years from now. And here, although humanity has spread throughout the vast galaxy, it's all mostly dominated by one dictatorship, the Galactic Empire. Empire, as it calls itself, is the biggest system of organization ever. And this is its capital. This is Trantor, where the Imperial Palace stands. But this is also where it gets a bit strange, because unlike your typical empire, there isn't just one ruler here. These three men, well, they rule together. And that's because they're actually the same man, but at different ages. You see, they're each a replica of the original emperor, Cleon I. Brother Dawn, the young learner, Brother Dusk, the elder advisor, and of course, Brother Day, the prime ruler. Together, they ensure a continuous line of leadership of this person that they all are, Cleon, so that he, or they, will always be in power. It's really any dictator's dream, right? To live forever as the most powerful man in the universe. But if you've seen the show, you'd know that seemingly out of nowhere, everything changes when a mathematician shows up. And he tries to take down the empire with a prediction. Now, when the very first Cleon was a child, this genetic dynasty didn't exist, of course. This boy here, well, he was the original Cleon. He was just a normal kid, well, born into the era of the old empire, but, as he grew up, he eventually became an old man, but he still hadn't found anyone to marry yet. And it's not because he didn't have any chances. You see, as a child, he found out about something that really should have been kept a secret, and it's behind this mural here. Here, he found a woman. Or so he thought. This is Demarcel, but she's actually not a woman. She's a robot. And she's been kept there as a slave by the ancestors of Cleon for thousands of years, as a reminder of the human victory in the war against robots many eons ago. But Cleon didn't see her like that. At first, he's scared, right? But he quickly becomes intrigued, and then he even grows to adore her. And so as he grows up, he starts going pretty frequently to see Demarcel, night after night. He doesn't release her from her prison, of course, but he comes to talk.
You're the only one who comes.
There's a mechanism in here to put you back together,
I would like very much to be free.
At least he does give her a better prison at some point. But yeah, he's intrigued because she knows things that no one else does. After all, she is 18,000 years old, and it fascinates Cleon. And so eventually, as he becomes an old man too, well, at that point, he's actually fallen in love with Demarcel. But of course, there's a problem here, because he's the heir of the empire. And he's expected, to continue the lineage of his dynasty.
Congratulations on your marriage.
I called it off.
But he doesn't want kids with anyone else. He wants Demarcel. Now, this isn't actually the only reason for starting his genetic dynasty, because Cleon, he's a smart guy, and he realizes, just as we know from our own history, that there's one big problem with human succession, with the current empire, with, hereditary rule or even dictatorship in general. You've probably heard the argument that the best form of government is a dictator who's just and fair, who's benevolent, right? As someone who prefers democracy, this type of system does really intrigue me, because a dictator doesn't need to rely on all the, checks and balances on power that we have in a democracy. So if they were good, it'd be a lot easier to do a lot of good for society too, right? But the big problem here, as Cleon realizes, is that what happens to that person, to their benevolence, when they inevitably die? Well, they have to pass on their power to their heir, and their heir might not be so benevolent, right? Especially if they've been born into power. But Cleon now has an answer for that. He has Demarcel. She could be his advisor. And because she's a robot that doesn't die, of natural causes, she could even make sure that all future Cleons will follow out his wishes. She could advise them forever. But as benevolent as Cleon thought his empire would become, it isn't quite that simple as you might imagine. Because there's one thing that he needs beyond Demarcel to ensure the success of his genetic dynasty, but it's also what corrupts him. As the generations of Cleons arose and passed, each one as a mythical figure, they became a god in the eyes of the population. He became an infallible ruler, a leader incapable of making mistakes. And it wasn't by accident. You see, there's this massive artwork in the Imperial Palace. It's actually where Cleon I originally found Demarcel behind, and it's a great example of how Cleon became this godlike figure. This is the Mural of Souls, and throughout the centuries, it became Brother Dusk's responsibility to maintain it. His job is to add to the story that depicts the galaxy's, 400 years of peace and prosperity under Cleon's rule. But this wall is actually more than just art too. It works actually more like a tool, and it's a tool used to promote a single story that empire doesn't air. This is actually something we all know pretty well, I think, but we call it propaganda in our world. And it's basically what all dictators rely on, right? And it's been like that for a long time. I mean, all the way back in the Roman Empire even, take the dictator Nero. He stayed in power because he made sure that he was depicted the right way. Back then it was through sculptures that showed him as a divine being, but 14 centuries later, just look at how Soviet newspapers depicted Stalin as a man who doesn't make mistakes. Dictators like Cleon, they've always been to their people how they're portrayed in sculptures or newspaper or whatever way of conveying that information is. And it's really not by accident. Because if you're portrayed as infallible, right? Well, that's the textbook way to make sure as a dictator, your people aren't gonna start questioning you. They certainly aren't gonna stand up to you, that's for sure, because at a certain point, people even start believing it too. And also, it's a great way to justify the concentration of your absolute power, because you don't make mistakes, right? Now, obviously, no dictator is a god or good for that reason. We're all fallible humans, even our leaders. As history shows, Nero, just like Stalin, eventually fell. But here's the thing. That's actually the difference, though, between empire and your average dictator, right? The replicas of Cleon, well, in a sense, they live on forever. So why would he ever fall? To some extent, he is infallible. While around 400 years into the seemingly eternal empire he created, this is when Harry Seldon, the mathematician, steps into the picture. And he exposes the big problem with the brothers, and he actually predicts the end of empire. But exposing the real problems in our world is really hard because our own leaders, like big corporations, like to spin stories to fit their agenda. That's why I'm really excited to have Ground News sponsor this video. What I really like about Ground News is how easy they make it to get an overview of how different news outlets frame the same story. Take the recent No Kings protests in the US. The coverage has over 300 sources, and we can see how it's framed by both the left and the right with the bias comparison feature. Here, the story has mostly left-leaning coverage, but it's also mostly covered by private equity too. And check this out, this conglomerate-owned outlet on the right chose to focus on how the teachers' union were prioritizing activism over education, while this independent outlet on the left framed it more as a rebellion against Trump. So Ground News basically helps us cut through the noise, and that's something I think is really important. You can subscribe to them using my link link below, scanning this QR code, or you can just go to ground.news/Werner and get unlimited access at 40% off their Vantage plan. That's actually also the one I use as well. Link with the discount below. Be quick as it won't last long. And thanks to Ground News for making this video possible. This here is Harry Seldon, and he recently developed a new kind of science. A science where he uses very complicated algorithms to literally predict the actions of large groups of people across vast stretches of time. He calls it psychohistory, as he explains to his protege Gale here.
Are you familiar with my work, Psychohistory?
Every mathematician has read your...
Do you agree with the concept?
In theory, but I don't know what it has to do with...
Oh, it's not a theory. It's the destiny of the human race expressed in numbers.
And with psychohistory, Seldon actually predicts the fall of empire. And it's a collapse that can't be averted, a fall into barbarism. And so he feels the need to let everyone know about it. That's why he goes public.
This period of barbarism, how long do you claim it will last?
30,000 years, advocate.
Whoa, that takes a lot of confidence to say, especially under Empire's rule. But Seldon thinks it's for the common good, right?
You've already said the future cannot be changed, so what exactly is the purpose of your project?
I'm trying to soften the fall.
Right, so it's not actually deterministic. Seldon has some hope to give, and this is what I mean. His math says that the coming Dark Age, well, it could actually be shortened to only last 1,000 years, but only if they do this very specific thing and they act now. Hearing this, Brother Day pretty much immediately arrests Seldon along with Gale, but during questioning, he's actually somewhat intrigued, and it's here that Seldon tells Empire exactly how to shorten the coming Dark Age.
End imperial cloning.
Imperial cloning stopped the wars. Imperial cloning brought peace.
Brother Dusk is outraged, and immediately he starts using, his propaganda points that legitimize Empire. The stuff he spends all day painting on the Mural of Souls, right? But as prime ruler, Brother Day stays collected.
Our genetic dynasty has reigned for almost 4 centuries. Surely you can understand the value in a younger mind who shares your intellect.
Well, I see the value in difference, in the new. You offer nothing new.
That right there, well, it encapsulates the big problem with Empire's rule, with autocratic rule, like a dictatorship, right? And it's precisely this something new that Seldon thinks Empire lacks. It's the thing that makes a society sustainable and fair, and why I think democracy is the best system that we've come up with. I'm talking about what the historian Yuval Noah Harari calls self-correcting mechanisms. These are mechanisms that we have, like, holding regular elections, or having independent courts, or having a free and independent media too. Because the point of these things is to correct the errors, the mistakes like corruption that inevitably seems to pop up in any central authority like a government. And these mechanisms, they're there exactly because democracy understands that we humans, well, that we're not infallible. We make mistakes. Think about an election, for example. The point of an election, right, is to correct any potential mistakes of a leader who hasn't carried out their promise. The promise that made the people vote for that leader in the first place. Now, in a dictatorship, these self-correcting mechanisms aren't welcome, and that's also why dictators want to be seen as infallible, right? So there's no need for replacement. But this is where it gets kind of complicated, because even though we might live in a democracy, we still seem to crave a system that is infallible. As Harari writes in Nexus, to escape the problem of human error, societies have often fantasized about some superhuman mechanism free from all error that they can rely upon to identify and correct their own mistakes. So what he's saying here is that it's part of human nature to want this infallible thing to satisfy, I guess, our existential need for certainty. And for the most part of history, we've had religion to kind of serve this exact purpose. But recently, something a lot more nefarious seems to have taken its place, and it's our own version of psychohistory. Wouldn't it be great if we had a way to predict the future so that we could fix it? I mean, think past the deterministic implications here. Maybe we'd be able to know how to deal with some of the big, existential problems we have, like AI and climate change. But the thing is, we actually do have something like this, like psychohistory, but it doesn't work half the time. But we all go around living our lives based on the assumption that it does. Okay, to unpack what I'm talking about here, I gotta mention this. While I was researching for this video, I came across an interview from the author of the Foundation books, Isaac Asimov.
I was essentially writing future history, and I had to make it sufficiently different from modern history to give it that science fictional touch. And so I assumed that the time would come when there would be a science in which things could be predicted on a probabilistic or statistical basis.
And he wasn't actually wrong, because some 70 years after he wrote those books, we have it today. And I realized that when I found this NPR podcast where two interviewees talk about Foundation and actually how reading Foundation in their teens set them up for life.
I really wanted to be a psychohistorian. I wanted to do what Harry Seldon had done. And I realized that the best incarnation of that in the real world was economics.
And here's the other guy, Ben Ho, a professor in economics.
Harry Seldon already laid the way to say we can predict people's behavior, we can predict politics, we can predict social movements through numbers and mathematics and equations. Okay, so what I'm, subtly getting at here is that psychohistory is like our version of economics. Now, even though, I applaud their resolve and where they're coming from, here's the thing. It doesn't quite work like that. And we see that in Foundation too. Because eventually, as it turns out, Seldon's psychohistory isn't actually omnipotent. There's something it doesn't predict, something kind of big actually. Psychohistory doesn't foresee the main antagonist of the story, the mule, a mutant who can manipulate human emotions. He'll probably be in season 3 that actually might already be out depending on when you see this. But the point is, even in Foundation, the model actually fails. But that's nothing compared to how it fails in our world.
Can you understand this, Timbersaw?
Not all of it.
So, in 2003, the Nobel Prize winner Robert Lucas gave a presidential address to the American Economics Association. Pretty confidently, he told them that the point of macroeconomics is to, quote, prevent the recurrence of economic disaster. Makes sense, right? But that now, he continued, it had actually succeeded. Again, in 2003, he said, its, quote, central problem of depression prevention has been solved. But I think we all know what happened just 5 years later, in 2008. The economy crashed, and with it came falling living standards and rising levels of inequality. Robert Lucas was obviously completely off the mark here, and that's my point. It's why one of my favorite economists, Yanis Varoufakis, writes that the economy is simply too, quote, important to leave to the economists. Kind of ironic, I know, but it's because, as he puts it, the more scientific our models of the economy become, the less relation they bear to the real existing economy out there. What he's getting at here is this obsession there is in economics to make it look like a hard science, like physics or something. But to make the math work, economists, they have to strip away all the parts of humanity that makes us messy, the real parts. They have to build their models on the assumption that we're all perfectly rational people. And of course, there's also a reason for that. Another really interesting economist, Ha-Joon Chang, actually compares the economics profession to the church, or more specifically to the Catholic clergy in the Middle Ages. Because back then, the Bible was written in Latin, right? And only in Latin. So if you couldn't read Latin, you'd have to go to a priest and they would tell you what God wanted. You basically had to rely on priests for the word of God. and that gave them a lot of power. And so Chang explains that modern economists do the exact same thing, but instead of Latin, they use complicated math models and economics jargon. Chang even thinks that economists have convinced most of us what they do is just too difficult for us to understand. Well, okay, sure, but why is that a problem? I mean, economics is pretty complicated. Well, it's a problem because it's used as a tool for suppression, and here's how. Let's take a look at the European Central Bank, but it might as well be the Federal Reserve or another, national central bank at the top. Its main legally mandated goal is to keep prices stable, to keep inflation down. Sounds pretty good, right? But the economists who are on that board, well, they weren't actually elected to be there. No, instead they were appointed by our leaders. But still, they serve these really long terms and, well, they make a lot of decisions that affect our lives, even though we didn't elect them. To Chang, this is, by design, quote, totally free from democracy. But it gets a lot worse than that, and this is where we actually also get back to Empire and Foundation, because the main conflict of the story isn't really about Selden's prediction. It's about the relationship between knowledge and power. I just want to mention that I really love making these videos, and it's really only possible because of you guys. So honestly, thank you so much. But it also takes such a long time, and it is just me doing this. So if you're enjoying the video, it helps the algorithm so much if you give the video a like and if you subscribe if you want to see more. Okay, back to it.
Psychohistory predicts psychohistory! We are Empire!
When Harry Seldon, the expert, presents his mathematics to Brother Day, the ruler, what happens? Well, Day doesn't just bow to the numbers, right? He questions Seldon, and he interrogates his methods. And then he does something kind of brilliant. Of course, he doesn't end the genetic dynasty like Seldon says is necessary, but he does actually heed Seldon's word to some extent, and actually, he ends up co-opting the entire project. So this is what he does. He exiles Seldon and Gale to establish a foundation, which is also, where the name of the show comes from. Because according to Seldon himself, this should also shorten the coming Dark Age just a little bit. So in essence, what Empire's done here is that, well, he hasn't ended his dynasty, but he hasn't killed Seldon either and made him into a martyr. It's really a very smart move if you think about it, because he takes this scientific prediction of doom and he spins it into a story of his own power and mercy.
I will be the Cleon who chose peace.
And that right there, well, that's exactly how a lot of our leaders use economics. So check this out. In her book, The Capital Order, economist Clara Mattei explains that this has actually been the case for a really long time. So after World War I, capitalism, believe it or not, was under threat. The working class was, organizing like never before. You could smell the revolutionary sentiment in the air because the people were fighting back. And that, of course, well, that was a big problem for those in power. And so amongst elites, there was, quote, a sense of terror around the threatened breakdown of the capital order. In fact, that's literally what the infamous economist John Maynard Keynes wrote. And so just like Brother Day, these elites did something brilliant too. And it happened in 1919 and then in 1922 when European leaders decided to hold the first two international financial conferences ever. And here they invited all the top economists from the time, because they wanted these economists to invent a, quote, true economic doctrine that would prevent the collapse of capitalism. And what the economists came up with over 100 years ago, well, it still haunts us today. They called it austerity. Cut public spending, suppress wages, and prioritize the interests of creditors. That's austerity. And it was, and it still is actually, presented as a sort of bitter medicine that we all have to take for the good of the country, for the good of the economy. Mattei argues that this was the moment in history when we started living under a little something called technocracy, which, by the way, is a system where leaders justify their decisions based on, supposedly neutral and objective experts, just like economists. And that's a problem, of course, because as we know from Ha-Joon Chang, economics isn't this mathematical objective science. It's actually kind of political. He even calls it ideological. Because, and I quote him here, behind technical concepts and dry numbers lie all sorts of value judgments. So what we have here, well, it's kind of like how Demarcel made it possible for Cleon to stay in power forever. But here, it's these economists that make it possible for leaders to justify their shitty decisions based on this infallible science. And we see this everywhere in our world today. Nowadays, as Varoufakis talks about, we know the 2008 financial crisis was caused by decades of our leaders deregulating the economy based on the so-called science of economics. They argued, and they still do, that deregulation is a good thing, because the market, well, it sorts itself out. But I think we all know what happened after the system crashed. Like, what did the unelected advising economists recommend, right? Well, it sure wasn't to punish the banks that caused the crisis. No, instead, the financial institutions that were deemed, too big to fail, well, they were just bailed out with trillions of dollars of public money. And meanwhile, the bitter medicine of, austerity, that was reserved for everyone else, for us. I mean, so many countries started cutting public services, school funding, infrastructure, pensions, and the list goes on. And we still feel the effects. But financial institutions were pardoned, and no one in any position of power was ever really held accountable for this. So let's call it for what it is. Socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. And it's exactly what we started embracing all the way back in the 1980s, actually. When, country after country started relaxing or just straight up getting rid of financial regulations. I mean, Chang goes into this pretty extensively, but I think you probably already know this. It's usually called neoliberalism, and it's all based on the idea that, free markets are infallible, based on the fact that markets sort themselves out. So there's no need for a central authority like a government to regulate them. But as we know from Foundation and even from our own history too, well, this is kind of just another one of those stories that's meant to make sure that people who have it all, the money or power, well, that they don't lose it. Since 2008, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Austerity and growing inequality, well, to some extent, we're experiencing these things because of our belief in the free, infallible market. If you've seen any of my other videos, I like to bring up the fact that I'm from Denmark. And I do it because I think, economically speaking, I think Denmark really nailed it on making a fair system. In the book Ill Fares the Land, the late but great historian Tony Judt talks about the great achievement of the post-World War II era that we live in. And it's this. The creation of the welfare state is what we have in Denmark, and it's actually not strictly anti-capitalist, contrary to popular belief. And it's not about charity either. We still have markets in Denmark, they're just more regulated. So the welfare state is really about regulating the economy and making sure everyone has the same opportunities. But ironically, it actually relies on a strong central authority to do this. But not like an autocracy or even a benevolent dictatorship. No, this authority, well, it has to be built on the very same thing that a dictatorship like empire doesn't do well with. What I'm talking about here, of course, is these strong, democratic, self-correcting mechanisms. And just like having a free and independent press and, holding elections, I think one of those self-correcting mechanisms is to regulate the economy. This is also what Judd talks about, and he bases it all on real data, by the way. Societies that are built on universal public services like free healthcare, education, pensions, things that don't do so well in the free market, right? Well, they create a baseline of security for us, and that reduces inequality and makes sure that everyone has a stake in the collective good. So as Judd shows, the welfare state is the foundation of a healthy society, because it prevents the desperation that makes autocratic rule seem attractive in the first place. Also, If, big bankers and leaders of our countries get to have their ass covered when the economy crashes, why shouldn't the rest of us? Because when it comes down to it, the goal really shouldn't be to serve the economy. The goal should be to have a better society. And unlike psychohistory, I don't think we need an equation to figure that one out. If you just want to listen to the podcast version of my stuff, check out my Patreon. It's also the best way to support me. And a very special thanks to Flacky for being a sponsor and Helen Mott for being a listener too. And of course, all my other supporters on Patreon. It means the world. And if you're interested in why it's so hard to change society and how we might go about it, check out my previous video here. Thanks for watching.